In this video, we're going to be going over what causes inflation in the long run. So the first theory that we have is the neutrality of money. And what the neutrality of money is saying is that no matter what the denomination says of money, it'll always have the same results and output that was previously stated. So that's kind of a brief description, but it makes more sense if you think about it. If the government were to change every single dollar value and add 2 zeros to it, so $1 becomes 100, 10 becomes 1,000, and 100 becomes 10,000. Well, in the short run, your value of the dollar would be increased and you'd be able to buy more, but that wouldn't last long because anyone who was supplying a haircut would then change their $20 haircut to a $2,000 haircut because they would have to do the same thing the government did and add 2 zeros to all of their prices. And so for the moment, you'd be able to buy a ton of haircuts with what was $1 at first, but pretty soon after, they would change that value to where now you're paying the same amount. You're paying $2,000 instead of 20, which makes sense because you have $10, which is now 1,000, and so they would all add up and counteract each other just at higher prices, but for the same value per se. The second theory is the classical theory of inflation. And what that is saying is if the government implemented expansionary monetary policy, it would shift the aggregate demand line up, and that would result in higher prices and higher output, but it would only be short-lived because the supply curve would then counteract, and it would just bring you to a higher point. It would bring you to the same output level, but a higher price, which, as we discussed, is what inflation is, the same output but for a higher price. And so while the expansionary policy may work for a second, in all reality, it's just causing inflation and brings prices to a higher point because the economy is going to figure itself out. The third theory is the quantity theory of money. And that's saying that the amount of money in the economy is only it only can be attributed to the actual money in the economy. And so if you're looking at it, if you have $1,000 in money in the economy, you better have $1,000 of actual value in the economy as well. And so there's a formula for this. It's the M times V equals P times Y. And this is the amount of money in circulation, the velocity of money equals the price level times output, or GDP. And so you can manipulate this formula if you don't have all the variables, and you can see whichever one you want to find. And if we assume that price level and amount in circulation were to stay level, well, then you can see that output and velocity, or GDP and velocity, would have to move in the same way. And you can also calculate velocity by reorganizing this formula and doing price level times GDP over monetary amount, supply, to get the velocity. And the velocity is how many times every dollar is spent throughout the year. So if one singular dollar is spent 3 different times, well, then that's your velocity, and you're able to get that by this formula. The last thing that causes inflation in the long run is inflation expectations. And that would be if people expect inflation to go up in the long run or in the future, well, then they're going to buy things now because they're scared of higher prices in the future. Well, if people buy a lot of things now, then demand increases, which makes suppliers increase at their price level, but people are still going to buy at that price level because they're scared they're going to get higher down the road. And so what that does is just create inflation in the moment and continues to grow inflation. These are the 4 things that cause inflation in the long run, and all play a factor in the economy.